decided to weigh in again on this particular hearing towards what went on in a 20-year stretch pertaining to the terrorist that has tried to destroy, reform, and corrupt the American democracy. I'm weighing in about halfway into this, or not even halfway into this, towards this individual that's making this particular announcement here, that's reading these things off. And I have edited it up to about half of it to where I want my viewers to actually hear. So we're going to hit the play button and let what's being said be said.
Mistake, I and others expect to be provided with the results of the timely, comprehensive, and transparent investigation of this tragedy, including accountability measures and any changes to procedures that are deemed necessary. Importantly, our work is not done, as there are more who remain in Afghanistan who would like to leave, and we must work to ensure the interagency has all the tools required and is coordinated to assist those remaining individuals. There are some, going back to the issue of whether or not we should have left Afghanistan, who imagined that there was sort of a middle option, that we could have kept 2,500 troops there in a relatively peaceful and stable environment. I think the way that option has been presented by many of the critics has been fundamentally disingenuous. The option of keeping 2,500 troops in Afghanistan in a peaceful and stable environment did not exist. I have heard many compare this to the troops that we have left in South Korea and Japan. I find that analogy just, completely idiotic, if I'm being honest. In South Korea and Japan, we are not under attack. We are there as a deterrent. In Afghanistan, we would have been under attack. And that is the fundamental fact that too many people are forgetting. The peace agreement that was signed by the previous president was based on a requirement that we get all of our troops out by May 1st. That's the only reason that the Taliban had not attacked us in the previous 18 months. Once that expired, once we said, nope, we're staying, they would have been under attack. And this has been the subject of a huge misunderstanding in the last 24 hours that, again, I find very, very disingenuous. People are saying that the president said, no one said that we should keep 2,500 there. When what the president actually said was there was no option on the table to keep 2,500 troops in Afghanistan in a stable environment. That's what he said. Not that no one presented that option. That option didn't exist in reality, and no one presented it. The president, in fact, made it clear earlier in that same interview that, yes, some of his military leaders had said that we should keep 2,500 troops there. What he said was none of them said that we could do it in a stable, peaceful environment. And that is the key point. The other key point is, and I know a lot of energy will be expended today trying to get these gentlemen to admit that they didn't agree with the president's decision. First of all, I never engage in that exercise because I believe the president, Democrat, Republican, no matter who it is, deserves the unabridged advice of his or her commanders. I mean, you can't give that if you're then going to have to go out in public and talk about it. But second of all, the president is the one in charge. This is ultimately what civilian control of the military means. And what I believe certainly there were military commanders who said, nope, we should stick it out, we should keep the 2,500 there. I think they were wrong. And so did the president. It's not that they didn't make the advice, it's that they were wrong. This committee has an enormous amount of respect for our military leadership. That does not mean that the military leadership is incapable of being wrong. And over the course of the last 20 years in Afghanistan, I would have thought we would have learned that lesson. President Biden had the courage to finally make the decision to say, no, we are not succeeding in this mission. Placing more American lives at risk will not change that. If we could credibly say, if we just stuck it out for another year, another 5, another 10, and got to a better result, that'd be a difficult call. Was that worth the risk? But we can't credibly say that. So we would have been putting American lives at risk for a mission that we had to know was not achievable. The president made the right call on that. There is the issue of how we withdrew. And I will say, and I've been critical of this, I think the effort to get the SIVs and the others who wanted to get out of Afghanistan certainly could have been handled better and could have been started sooner. It certainly seemed rushed, and I want to hear from our leaders today about how that played out. But again, let's remember that the other alternative was not easy. The alternative of let's start pulling people out sooner, The Ghani government, the government that was in charge of Afghanistan at the time we would have been doing this, was adamantly opposed to us pulling all of the military equipment and hundreds of thousands of their Afghan supporters out for obvious reasons. How would we have done that against the objection of the existing Afghan government while the Taliban were rolling across the countryside? It would not have been easy, no matter how it was done. But we do deserve an accounting for how those decisions were made forward. I think today is an excellent opportunity to do that. I look forward to the questions and answers as well as the testimony of our witnesses. And with that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I have great admiration for my friend, the chairman, I could not disagree more with his observations about Afghanistan and the president's decision. The fact is, our coalition partners and our military leadership felt that we should have maintained our 2,500 troops there, along with the roughly 7,500 to 8,000 coalition troops, and the thousands of contractors that the Afghan army was dependent upon to fight successfully. And I think they could have continued, as they have in past years, to fight valiantly had we given that support and the president had listened to his general's advice. But regardless of how you feel about the decision to remove troops from Afghanistan, I think we can all agree that the withdrawal was an unmitigated disaster. Hundreds of Americans were left behind, thousands of Afghan allies stuck with little hope of escape, potentially billions worth of U.S. provided military equipment now in the hands of the Taliban, thousands of hardened al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists freed from prisons, 10 innocent Afghans, including 7 children, killed in a botched airstrike. But worst of all, 13 brave Americans, service members, were murdered by a coward in a suicide vest. What's more infuriating is that all this could have been avoided if the president had a plan. In briefings and hearings since April, we've demanded to know a plan to A, safely evacuate Americans and Afghan allies, and B, conduct counterterrorism operations. For 4 months, the response from the Biden administration was, we're working on it. Now it's clear they never had a plan. The president repeatedly assured the American people that the Taliban takeover was not inevitable, that we had plenty of time to safely evacuate Americans and Afghan allies, that this was not going to be a fall like Saigon. As late as August 19th, the president promised us that if there's an American citizen left, we're going to stay to get them all out. Now it's clear the president has misled us more than once. On August 31st, hundreds of Americans left behind, the 13 service members murdered. The president stood in the East Room of the White House and called the withdrawal, quote, an extraordinary success, close quote. I fear the president is delusional. This wasn't an extraordinary success. It was an extraordinary disaster. It will go down in history as one of the greatest failures of American leadership. We're here today to get answers on how the hell this happened. I expect our witnesses to give us an honest accounting of exactly what went wrong. I also want answers on how we're going to conduct counterterrorism operations now that we have zero presence in Afghanistan. This was the first question we asked you in April, and we still don't have an answer. According to the latest intelligence assessment, it could be as little as 12 months before al-Qaeda will use Afghanistan as a base to conduct airstrikes or strikes against the United States, and that's unacceptable. And this talk of over-the-horizon capability is a farce. Sure, we can send a drone out to take out a terrorist, but we didn't know where the terrorists are. Without persistent ISR capabilities or reliable intelligence on the ground, that's impossible. We have neither of those now. It doesn't help that we need to fly that drone nearly 1,600 miles to reach Afghanistan, leaving little time on station, or that we have to fly over Pakistan, an ally of the Taliban, who could revoke overflight privileges at any time. None of this is giving us much confidence that this administration can successfully conduct counterterrorism in Afghanistan. We want to know what capabilities we need, where they will be based, and how they'll be used. In other words, we want to see a plan, and we want to see it today. Because frankly, after this debacle of a withdrawal, I don't think anyone can trust anything this president says about Afghanistan. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, you are recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our recent drawdown and evacuation operations in Afghanistan. I'm pleased to be joined by Generals Milley and McKenzie, who I know will be able to provide you with additional context. I am incredibly proud of the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces who conducted themselves with tremendous skill and professionalism throughout the war, the drawdown, and the evacuation. Over the course of our nation's longest war, 2,461 of our fellow Americans made the ultimate sacrifice, along with more than 20,000 who still bear the wounds of war, some of which cannot be seen on the outside. Now, we can discuss and debate the decisions, the policies, and the turning points since April of this year, when the president made clear his intent to end American involvement in this war. And we can debate the decisions over the last 20 years that led us to this point. But the one thing not open to debate is the courage and compassion of our service members, who, along with their families, served and sacrificed to ensure that our homeland would never again be attacked the way it was on September 11, 2001. I had the chance to speak with many of them during my trip to the Gulf region a few weeks ago, including the Marines who lost 11 of their teammates at the Abbey Gate in Kabul on the 26th of August. I've never been more humbled and inspired. They are rightfully proud of what they accomplished and the lives they saved in such a short period of time. The reason that our troops were able to get there so quickly is because we planned for just such a contingency. We began thinking about the possibilities for a non-combatant evacuation as far back as this spring. By late April, 2 weeks after the president's decision, military planners had crafted a number of evacuation scenarios. In mid-May, I ordered CENTCOM to make preparations for a potential non-combatant evacuation operation. And 2 weeks later, I began pre-positioning forces in the region to include 3 infantry battalions. On the 10th of August, we ran another tabletop exercise around a non-combatant evacuation scenario. We wanted to be ready, and we were. By the time that the State Department called for the NEO, significant numbers of additional forces had already arrived in Afghanistan, including leading elements of the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit, who were already on the ground in Kabul. Before that weekend was out, another 3,000 or so ground troops had arrived, including elements of the 82nd Airborne. To be clear, those first 2 days were difficult. We all watched with alarm the images of Afghans rushing the runway in our aircraft. We all remember the scene of confusion.
Sorry, we'll get that under control. Go ahead, sir.
Outside the airport, but within 48 hours, our troops restored order and the process began to take hold. Our soldiers, airmen, and Marines, in partnership with our allies, our partners, and our State Department colleagues, secured the gates, took control of the airport operations, and set up a processing system for the tens of thousands of people that they would be manifesting onto airplanes. They and our commanders exceeded all expectations. We plan to evacuate between 70,000 and 80,000 people. They evacuated more than 124,000 people. We plan to move between 5,000 and 9,000 people per day, and on average, they move slightly more than 7,000 people per day. On military aircraft alone, we flew more than 387 sorties, averaging nearly 23 per day. And at the height of this operation, an aircraft was taking off every 45 minutes. And not a single sortie was missed for maintenance, fuel, or logistical problems. It was the largest airlift conducted in U.S. history, and it was executed in just 17 days. Was it perfect? Of course not. We moved so many people so quickly out of Kabul that we ran into capacity and screening problems at intermediate staging bases outside of Afghanistan. And we're still working to get Americans out who wish to leave. We did not get out all of our Afghan allies enrolled in a special immigrant visa program, and we take that seriously. And that's why we're working across the interagency to continue facilitating their departure. And even with no military presence on the ground, that part of our mission is not over. And tragically, lives were also lost. Several Afghans killed climbing aboard an aircraft on that first day. 13 brave U.S. service members and dozens of Afghan civilians killed in a terrorist attack on the 26th, and we took as many as 10 innocent lives in a drone strike on the 29th. Non-combatant evacuations remain among the most challenging military operations, even in the best of circumstances. And the circumstances in August were anything but ideal. Extreme heat, a landlocked country, no government, a highly dynamic situation on the ground, and an active, credible, and lethal terrorist threat. In the span of just 2 days, from August 13th to August 15th, we went from working alongside a democratically elected, long-term partner government to coordinating warily with a longtime enemy. We operated in a deeply dangerous environment, and it proved a lesson in pragmatism and professionalism. We also learned a lot of other lessons too, like about how to turn an Air Force base in Qatar to an international airport overnight, and about how to rapidly screen, process, and manifest large numbers of people. Nothing like this has ever been done before, and no other military in the world could have pulled it off. And I think that that's crucial. And I know that members of this committee will have questions on many things, such as why we turned over Bagram Airfield, and how real our over-the-horizon capability is, and why we didn't start evacuation sooner, and why we didn't stay longer to get more people out. So let me take each in turn. Retaining Bagram would have required putting as many as 5,000 U.S. troops in harm's way just to operate and defend it. And it would have contributed little to the mission that we had been assigned, and that was to protect and defend the embassy, which was some 30 miles away. And that distance from Kabul also rendered Bagram of little value in the evacuation. So staying at Bagram, even for counterterrorism purposes, meant staying at war in Afghanistan, something that the president made clear that he would not do. And as for over-the-horizon operations, when we use that term, we refer to assets and target analysis that come from outside the country in which the operation occurs. These are effective and fairly common operations. And just days ago, we conducted one such strike in Syria, eliminating a senior Al-Qaeda figure. Over-the-horizon operations are difficult, but absolutely possible. And the intelligence that supports them comes from a variety of sources and not just U.S. boots on the ground. As for when we started evacuations, we offered input to the State Department's decision, mindful of their concerns that moving too soon might actually cause the very collapse of the Afghan government that we all wanted to avoid. And that moving too late would put our people and our operations at greater risk. As I said, the fact that our troops were on the ground so quickly is due in large part to our planning and pre-positioning of forces. As for the mission's end, my judgment remains that extending beyond the end of August would have greatly imperiled our people and our mission. The Taliban made clear that their cooperation would end on the 1st of September. And as you know, we faced grave and growing threats from ISIS-K. So staying longer than we did would have made it even more dangerous for our people and would not have significantly changed the number of evacuees we could get out. So as we consider these tactical issues today, we must also ask ourselves some equally tough questions about the wider war itself, and pause to think about the lessons that we've learned over the past 20 years. Did we have the right strategy? Did we have too many strategies? Did we put too much faith in our ability to build effective Afghan institutions, an army, an air force, a police force, and government ministries? We helped build a state, but we could not forge a nation. The fact that the Afghan army that we and our partners trained simply melted away, in many cases without firing a shot, took us all by surprise, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. We need to consider some uncomfortable truths. That we did not fully comprehend the depth of corruption and poor leadership in their senior ranks. That we did not grasp the damaging effect of frequent and unexplained rotations by President Ghani of his commanders. That we did not anticipate the snowball effect caused by the deals that the Taliban commanders struck with local leaders in the wake of the Doha Agreement. that the Doha Agreement itself had a demoralizing effect on Afghan soldiers, and that we failed to fully grasp that there was only so much for which and for whom many of the Afghan forces would fight. We provided the Afghan military with equipment and aircraft and the skills to use them. And over the years, they often fought bravely, and tens of thousands of Afghan soldiers and police officers died. But in the end, we couldn't provide them with the will to win, at least not all of them. And as a veteran of that war, I am personally reckoning with all of that. But I hope, as I said at the outset, that we do not allow a debate about how this war ended to cloud our pride in the way that our people fought it. They prevented another 9/11. They showed extraordinary courage and compassion in the war's last days. They made lasting progress in Afghanistan that the Taliban will find difficult to reverse and that the international community should work hard to preserve. And now, our service members and civilians face a new mission, helping these Afghan evacuees move on to new lives in new places. And they are performing that one magnificently as well. I spent some time with some of them up at Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst this past Monday. And I know that you share my profound gratitude and respect for their service, their courage, and professionalism, and I appreciate the support that this committee continues to provide them and their families. Thank you.
Chairman Milley.
He said that they prevented from another 9/11 attack from happening. In exchange of 9/11 pertaining to 4 airplanes that had been hijacked and suddenly lunged off into areas that they're not supposed to be lunged off into, I agree on that magnitude that we prevented. But on the other hand, pertaining to all these little bitty cells that have now escalated throughout the world, that are set up in different areas, we didn't stop, we didn't prevent, we didn't slow down any of those terrorist groups that today are still formulating some sort of resistant attack upon to the free democracy of what the Americans created hundreds of years ago that now other nations have adhered to. These evil people pertaining to the terrorists are not going to quit, will not stop until you basically rid or decapitate the head from the leader that is spewing out this type of poison to begin with. That is where the American military or the American country has failed. Now, I've heard stories such as, well, Russia tried to defeat the Taliban and they didn't achieve their objective. Once more, you cannot go into a combat field on the back end or in the middle and think that you're actually going to do any good, while the front end, why the head is still financing and spewing and putting out all types of other terrorist type propaganda that is feeding all these little ones, all these little cells. In other words, once more, the American government did not go to the head. They did not try to decapitate the head of the snake of where all this was spewing from and being resonated from to begin with. Yes, we destroyed bin Laden. But keep in mind, bin Laden was only being used as a ploy from his own people. That way it would have created a discursion, in which it did. It created a discursion towards taking our eyes off of one particular sector or group of people, and now suddenly, all of a sudden, putting them on another sector group of people that no doubt was a bad group of people. The people over in Afghanistan pertaining to the Taliban and all the other ISIS and all the other terrorist known entities in that area are bad, horrible people. But once more, you're taking out the middle chambers, are trying to work on the back end or the middle end, and you're not going to the front end. Until we wisen up towards who actually perpetrated all this, not just with 9/11, but all the other terrorist type attacks that has been going on for the past, I guess, 40 years, for the past 4 or 5 decades, until we open up our eyes to that and realize who actually manifested this and who is still indirectly manifesting these things, we're never going to be able to look at one another in the eyes and say we have defeated our enemy. The terrorist known entities that wanted to take out not just the American people, but basically the Christian people up onto this planet, because working through their corrupt Sharia law ideology, they feel like that they have the right or the privilege of dominating society and becoming the unchallenged force up onto this planet. That's the reason why that we had to leave with basically our tail tucked between our legs, the way that we did shamefully out of Afghanistan in an exiting strategy within a matter of just days. May God have mercy on all of us in what has occurred. Going not back 20 years, but going back 30 plus years with the White House that thought that it was going to be able to bamboozle, corrupt, deceive, manipulate its very own Christian society here in the United States of America. May God have mercy on all of us.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, thank you for the opportunity to be here with Secretary Austin and General McKenzie to discuss Afghanistan. During the past 20 years, the men and women of the United States military, along with our allies and partners, fought the Taliban, brought Osama bin Laden to justice, denied al-Qaeda sanctuary, and protected our homeland for 2 consecutive decades. Over 800,000 of us in uniform served in Afghanistan. Most importantly, 2,461 U.S. soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines paid the ultimate price. 20,698 were wounded in action, and countless others suffered the invisible wounds of war. There's no doubt in my mind that our efforts prevented an attack on the homeland from Afghanistan, which was our core mission. And everyone who ever served in that war in Afghanistan should be proud. Your service mattered. Beginning in 2011, we steadily drew down our troop numbers, consolidated and closed bases, and retrograded equipment from Afghanistan. At our peak in 2011, we had 97,000 U.S. troops alongside 41,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. 10 years later, when Ambassador Khalilzad signed the Doha Agreement with Mullah Beretta on 29 February 2020, the United States had 12,600 troops with 8,000 NATO and 10,500 contractors in Afghanistan. This has been a 10-year multi-administration drawdown, not a 19-month retrograde or 17-day non-combatant evacuation operation. Under the Doha Agreement, the United States will begin to withdraw its forces contingent upon the Taliban meeting certain conditions, which would lead to a political agreement between the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. There were 7 conditions applicable to the Taliban and 8 to the United States. While the Taliban did not attack the United States forces, which was one of the conditions, it failed to fully honor any other condition under the Doha Agreement. And perhaps most importantly for the United States national security, the Taliban has never renounced their linkages with Al-Qaeda or broke their affiliation with them. We, the United States, adhered to every condition. In the fall of 2020, my analysis then was that an accelerated withdrawal without meeting specific and necessary conditions risks losing the substantial gains made in Afghanistan, would potentially damage U.S. worldwide credibility, and could precipitate a general collapse of the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government, resulting in a complete Taliban takeover or general civil war. That analysis was a year ago. Based on my advice and the advice of the commanders at the time, then Secretary of Defense Esper submitted a memorandum on 9 November, recommending that we maintain the U.S. forces, which were then at about 4,500 in Afghanistan, until conditions were met for further reductions. 2 days later, on 11 November, I received an unclassified signed order directing the United States military to withdraw all forces from Afghanistan by 15 January 2021. After further discussion regarding the risks associated with such a withdrawal, the order was rescinded. On 17 November, we received a new order to reduce troop levels to 2,500 plus enabling forces no later than 15 January. When President Biden was inaugurated, there were approximately 3,500 U.S. troops, 5,400 NATO, and 6,300 contractors in Afghanistan, tasked to train, advise, and assist a small contingent of counterterrorism forces. And the strategic situation was stalemate. The Biden administration, through the National Security Council process, conducted a rigorous interagency review of the situation in Afghanistan in February, March, and April. During this process, the views of all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of us, the CENTCOM Commander General McKenzie, U.S. 4A Commander General Miller, and myself were all given serious consideration by the administration. We provided a broad range of options in our assessment of their potential outcomes. We couched that in cost, benefit, risk to force, risk to mission. All of that was evaluated against the national security objectives of the United States. On 14 April, the President of the United States, President Biden, announced his decision, and the U.S. military received a change of mission to retrograde all U.S. military forces, maintain a small contingency force of 600 to 700 to protect the embassy in Kabul until the Department of State could coordinate contractor security support, and also to assist Turkey to maintain the Hamid Karzai International Airport and to transition the U.S. mission to over-the-horizon counterterrorism support and security force assistance. It is clear, it is obvious to all of us that the war in Afghanistan did not end on the terms that we wanted, with the Taliban now in power in Kabul. Although the NEO was unprecedented and is the largest air evacuation in history, was a tactical, operational, and logistical success, evacuating 124,000 people, the war was a strategic failure. It came also at an incredible cost in the end, with 11 Marines, 1 soldier, and a Navy corpsman. These 13 gave their lives so that people they never met would have an opportunity to live in freedom. And we must remember that the Taliban was and remains a terrorist organization, and they still have not broken with Al-Qaeda. I have no illusions who we are dealing with. It remains to be seen whether or not the Taliban can consolidate power or if the country will further fracture into civil war. But we must continue to protect the United States of America and its people from terrorist attacks from Afghanistan. A reconstituted Al-Qaeda or ISIS with aspirations to attack the United States is a very real possibility. And those conditions, to include activity in ungoverned spaces, could present themselves in the next 12 to 36 months. That mission will be much harder now, but not impossible, and we will continue to protect the American people. Strategic decisions have strategic consequences. Over the course of 4 presidents, 12 secretaries of defense, 7 chairmen, 10 CENTCOM commanders, and 20 commanders in Afghanistan, and hundreds of congressional delegation visits and 20 years of congressional oversight, there are many lessons to be learned. Among those lessons is the unprecedented speed of the collapse of the ANSF. However, one lesson we can never forget is that every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who served there for 20 years protected our country against attack from terrorists. And for that, we all should be forever grateful, and those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines should be forever proud. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to address a couple of comments about my personal conduct that's been in the media lately.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you may. Go ahead.
I've served this nation for 42 years. I've spent years in combat and buried a lot of my troops who died while defending this country. My loyalty to this nation, its people, and the Constitution hasn't changed and will never change as long as I have a breath to give. My loyalty to the Constitution and to this nation is absolute, and I will not turn my back on my fallen. With respect to the Chinese calls, I routinely communicated with my counterpart, General Lee, with the knowledge and coordination of civilian oversight. I am specifically directed to communicate with the Chinese by Department of Defense guidance in a document known as the Policy Dialogue System. These military-to-military communications at the highest levels are critical for the security of the United States in order to deconflict military actions, manage crisis, and prevent war between great powers armed with nuclear weapons. The calls on 30 October and 8 January were coordinated before and after with Secretary Esper and Acting Secretary Miller's staffs and the interagency. The specific purpose of the October and January calls was generated by concerning intelligence which caused us to believe the Chinese were worried about an attack by the United States. And last night I briefed that intelligence in detail to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I'll be happy to brief it to any member or group of members at your discretion in a classified session. And I know, and I am certain, President Trump did not intend on attacking the Chinese, and it is my directed responsibility by the Secretary of Defense to convey that intent. My task at that time was to de-escalate. My message was again consistent: calm, steady, de-escalate. We're not going to attack you. At Secretary of Defense Esper's direction, I made a call to General Lee on 30 October. 8 people sat in that call with me, and I read out the call within 30 minutes of the call ending. On 31 December, the Chinese requested a call with me. The department's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia Pacific Policy helped coordinate my call, which was then scheduled for 8 January. And he made a preliminary call on 6 January. 11 people attended the call with me, and readouts of this call were distributed to the interagency that same day. On 14 December, then Acting Secretary of Defense Miller had been briefed on the entire program. Shortly after my call ended with General Lee, I informed both Secretary of State Pompeo and White House Chief of Staff Meadows about the call, among several other topics. Soon after that, I attended a meeting with Acting Secretary Miller, where I briefed him on the call. Later that same day, on 8 January, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, called me to inquire about the President's ability to launch nuclear weapons. I sought to assure her that nuclear launch is governed by a very specific and deliberate process. She was concerned and made various personal references characterizing the President. I explained to her that the President is the sole nuclear launch authority, but he doesn't launch them alone, and that I am not qualified to determine the mental health of the President of the United States. There are processes, protocols, and procedures in place, and I repeatedly assured her there is no chance of an illegal, unauthorized, or accidental launch of nuclear weapons. The presidential directive and SecDef directives, the chairman is part of this process to ensure that the president is fully informed when determining the use of the world's deadliest weapons. By law, I am not in the chain of command, and I know that. However, by presidential directive and Department of Defense instruction, signed by the President and Secretaries of Defense, I am in the chain of communication to fulfill my legal statutory role as the President's primary military advisor. After the Speaker Pelosi call, I convened a short meeting in my office with key members of my staff to refresh all of us on these procedures, which we practice 3 times a day at the action officer level. Additionally, I immediately informed Acting Secretary of Defense Miller of her call. At no time was I attempting to change or influence the process, usurp authority, or insert myself into the chain of command. But I am expected to give my advice and ensure the President is fully informed on military affairs. I am submitting for the record, and I believe you have it, a couple of memorandums for record, in addition to detailed timelines, and I am happy to discuss in further detail in either classified or unclassified sessions with any or all of you about my actions surrounding these events. I welcome a thorough walkthrough. I'll be happy to provide whatever documents, phone logs, emails, memoranda, witnesses, or anything else you want that'll help you understand these events. My oath is to support the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I will never turn my back on that oath. I firmly believe in civilian control of the military as a bedrock principle and essential to the health of this republic, and I'm committed to ensuring the military stays clear of domestic politics. Thank you, Chairman, for the extra time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
I want to weigh in real quick on what he just said. Judging upon the appearances that people like myself sat back and watched during the exchange of all these things that he's talking about with Donald J. Trump, apparently it must to have arisen onto a level that the Speaker of the House took extra precautions in making sure that he did not have access to doing something erratical during the exchange of everything that was going on, because there was a lot of stuff leading into January the 6th. A lot of stuff that was going on that was concerning. And it was concerning with head departments of our government pertaining to the things that was being said, the things that was being done, that was not reaching the level of normal presidency. So by me saying that, apparently it must to have arisen on levels that this individual that just got through giving his testimony felt like that it was deemed necessary to make that telephone call to assure other heads of other countries that had the same type of nuclear capability as we did, that all things is fine. And it just sounds like, with the rhetoric going on, that things could boil over and something erratical could happen. But he was confirming to one of our, and you gotta face the fact that China and places like that are still deemed as being an enemy force to us, even though we exchange goods with them, but based around their communism controlled laws of how that they deal with their own people, we cannot consider them a true ally. So what this individual was doing was confirming that everything on a military perspective was in fact kosher and it was okay. That was all that he was doing. But on the other level, pertaining to what was going on with Donald Trump's administration and all the other stuff pertaining to the and we're still getting that type of feedback from Donald Trump to this day, that the election had been rigged, and that he has said so much in exchange to leading up to this. I still wonder if it wasn't done initially, intentionally, to set up some sort of an agreement with the Taliban, that whenever the next administration dealt with this, because I think he had a pretty good idea of the things that he had already said and done, that he wasn't going to become a second-term president. I personally feel like that he possibly intentionally set this thing up with the agreement with the Taliban to the point that he knew that it was going to become a debacle. He intended for it to become a debacle the way that it did during the exiting of over 120,000 people over in Afghanistan. That's my point of view. That's my assessment in what I have seen and heard. But it still falls back to the fault of the feet of those before this administration, before the Trump administration, before the Clinton administration, before even the Bush administration, of whenever we actually got attacked 20 years ago. You got to go back several administrations back to figure out the core of origin towards what upset the apple cart to begin with, because we was not engaged in this type of terrorism leading into or after Ronald Reagan's administration. Everything before then, yeah, there may have been some bumps in the road pertaining to some nut jobs out there like Jim Jones or whatever. Different things that's went on, even with other occult leaders. I think one of them was up in Washington State. Had something to do with Korea. There's been bumps in the road. There's been bumps in the road, but not on the level that we're seeing it now pertaining to wide world terrorism. These things has basically come into an existence just within the past 30 plus years on the level that it's on now. Yeah, you can go back into the exchange whenever the Carter administration was going over into the Reagan administration towards the plane that had been kidnapped, of holding of the hostages there. You can go back to that era, but it wasn't on the level like we're seeing it today. And it didn't cost everybody and their brother, basically the farm, just to be able to take care of ourselves and to watch out for this imminent danger that has now manifested itself in the past 30 plus years. So you have to start asking the simple question, what has happened? How come that the predictions of the Bible is coming true towards the risation of the demonic forces that it talks about in the last days in great wrath, because this evil entity realizes that its time is short? What has occurred? What has happened? I'm going to tell you what's happened. There's been some mistakes up there in the White House beginning of the latter part of Reagan's administration leading into Mr. Bush Sr.'s administration that has now tattered our military and our security here in the United States to the point that it has become a cesspool of nothing but chaos and anarchy, which is just the very opposite of peace and utopia that I continue to keep preaching and teaching and telling people about the opening of the first seal in the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Now, my son and I personally went to all the congressmen and various people in the government estate in 1989, handing them literature, telling them about the first seal, about the war of Armageddon, about the final war of all wars. And of course, after coming home, I went back on another crusade, and that's whenever Homeland Security decided that they was going to chart me, follow me from Washington, D.C. down to Tennessee, trying to figure out who I was, what group I was associated with, why that I was doing the things that I was doing. And it's one thing if you want to do an assessment on an individual, or let's say you're examining somebody for whatever reason. They went further than that. The American government went further than that. Being assisted through Homeland Security down in Madison County, Tennessee, in Jackson, Tennessee, they deliberately attacked a ministry that was being fumigated at that time. They deliberately attacked a ministry and confiscated an article from that ministry in trying to knock that ministry in the head and stop that ministry in its tracks by thinking that if we take this article from this ministry, this individual will shut up, lay down, put his tail between his legs, and go on about his merry business and live out his life as a normal citizen of the United States of America. Well, they was wrong. I didn't shut up. I didn't lay down. I didn't surrender. I didn't put my tail between my legs. Now, granted, they've made it hard on the founder of the Windmill Ministries. They've made it extremely hard by not only not supporting the ministry that supported peace and utopia, but actually setting back and either directly or indirectly allowing for the founder of the ministry to be attacked again and again, again and again and again. And if they themselves wasn't involved in this attack mode, this resistance towards not wanting to allow for this ministry to breathe any life into itself, to where it become effective, to where it become productive in the eyes of society. If they themselves wasn't doing it directly, indirectly, they know it was going on to the extent that they was sitting back and allowing it to happen. That's what has jinked us. I'm going to use a terminology that most people here in America can quite frankly understand. That is what jinxed us. From that moment on, whenever 9 tapes wound up going to the White House and Secret Service put it upon to themselves that they was going to attack somebody that was working under the guidelines of the Constitution of freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, freedom of religion, they wanted to make sure that they not only crippled that ministry, that entity, but they wanted to dissolve it. They wanted to completely ruin it. They wanted to destroy the Windmill Ministries. Well, now 30-something years has passed, and now the very thing that they was wishing and hoping that was going to happen to the founder of the Windmill Ministries is now happening to them. In full circle. It has come back and bitten them in the ass. All this horrible bad luck, trillions of dollars in debt, can't build prisons quick enough because of the crime that's being committed out on the streets here in America, the gun violence, the drug overdoses, children are being killed, illegal aliens is coming over the border, and now 20 years into an endless war that, as far as I'm concerned, should have been over with the day that they killed bin Laden. Now we're having to eat our own words by accepting this fate that instead of bringing stability to that region, we have probably, in essence, brought more chaos. Yeah, we may have left a footprint in regards towards the Western civilization, towards how a civilized people is supposed to conduct themselves on a civilized way as far as democracy. But we've also left that same footprint over in Russia and other parts of South America and Mexico and other parts of the world, and we see today how that same desire or entity of being a free, fair election towards its free people has basically been corrupted. It's been compromised. I mean, they may call it a fair election over in Russia, but we know that people over there are still scared to voice their opinions. We know that whenever it comes to the elections, the majority of them is paid off one-sided, not only over there, but in other parts of the world, all over the world, they're still doing it. In other words, they're promoting that they're doing the right thing, but in reality, they're not. They're still holding their people hostage. They're still being tyrants. They're still being oligarchs that's controlling that particular group of people or that region in that particular area. So now that has blown up. That has went south. Once more, what has jinxed the American civilization towards our ancestors that was so dead set that they was not going to allow for anything like this to occur, that they actually engineered not only the nuclear bomb but the atom bomb and used it against individuals overseas in ending the corruption pertaining to World War II, just so you and I could have the freedoms that we supposedly have today to be able to do what we do today. Once more, those freedoms was violated going all the way back to 1989 in Madison County, Jackson, Tennessee, in front of a parking lot that used to be the old Waterhole or Tremors nightclub. That particular exchange of events that happened to the ministry was basically whenever this nation was jinxed, because it started defiling its own rules and regulations. It started defiling its own constitution. And of course, in the past 30 plus years, you can't blame it just on one particular party. You got to blame it on society in general, because in the past 30 plus years, putting out the amount of time, energy, money, and material that I put out, to this day, I still do not have what you would call a support group or a congregation that stands with or for the Windmill Ministries. Now, they'll tell you, okay, that, oh, we want peace. We don't want rapes. We don't want murders. We don't want corruption in our streets. We don't want these drugs. We don't want all these guns. We want to get along with all the other nations. We want to live like a civilized society. They'll tell you this out of one side of their mouths. But on the other hand, the same politicians that, as far as I'm concerned, has turned into the very enemy of the people of the United States of America. Because as far as I'm concerned, they have turned into assassins. They have assassinated our Constitution. They have assassinated our dreams and desires that our original ancestors had pertaining to a democracy. They have assassinated various people's lives, such as myself, towards not allowing for this individual to ever have the freedoms or the wits or having the ability to get on a radio station without being banded, or go to these churches without being banded. This has been brought upon to the so-called church communities that did not want to participate in a ministry, knowing that the ministry stood for peace and utopia. So they have tried to sabotage the ministry. They have tried to end the ministry. They have tried to destroy the ministry. And they felt as if that if we could destroy the founder of the ministry, we would destroy the ministry. Well, guess what? The founder's still talking. The individual that you intended to destroy is still alive and well and kicking today. So your attempts that started not just in 1989, but going all the way back to 1983 in a little town called Kenton, Tennessee, that's supposed to be the white squirrel capital of the United States, used their corrupt powers to want to brand, scar, manipulate, go on in a character assassination adventure of the individual that's talking to you right now, that began whenever two hands miraculously come out of heaven that spared my life whenever a 1979 Buick Regal should have cut me completely, totally in half. After me losing over 9 units of blood and having to have my spleen removed, I'm still living. God still had his hand up onto me then. God still got his hand up onto me now. Now, does that mean that I'm perfect? No. Does that mean that I'm holier than thou? No. Does that mean that I haven't made mistakes in the past? No. But what it does mean is that I'm still living, I'm still breathing, I can still perform, I can still talk, I can still use my mind, and I can still tell my story to the people that want to hear it, pertaining to the corruption that has caused this with an entity here in the United States that thought that it was going to be able to bamboozle, thought that it was going to be able to overpower not only the saints of God that was living then and still living to this day, because there are a few of us that's striving towards the ways of righteousness, but thought that they was going to be able to actually manipulate God himself. The very God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of the Lord Jesus Christ, they actually thought that they was going to be able to manipulate God Almighty. The same type of idiocy that the Pharaohs thought that they was going to be able to do with Moses and Moses' God going back 4,000 plus years ago. So this type of resistance isn't new. If anything, it's probably to be expected. But what is new, now we can see that it has made a 180-degree turn that's turned into a 360-degree turn that has now gone full circle to the point now that all the misery, sorrow, anguish, pain that they intended to go towards God and God's people are now resignating into their own laps, that the fault has fallen upon to the feet of those that has been in power for the past 30 some odd years. And they don't like people like me because I'm broad-minded enough that I can not only see the trees through the forest, but I can go beyond 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and I can actually dissect towards what has went on here, understanding the powers at bay. Once more, what does the Bible say? It says that in the last days, Satan will rise up in great wrath because he knoweth his time is short. We didn't have all these multiple suicides. We didn't have all these gun incidences pertaining to these mass murders back before the Ronald Reagan era. We do now. We didn't have people driving airplanes off into buildings. We do now. We didn't have people like David Koresh and Timothy McVeigh and Nichols pertaining to the Oklahoma bombing. We do now. We didn't have all these school shootings and all these children's minds that's been messed up of getting on drugs. We didn't have this thing called meth that basically, the way that I understand it, this methanol or whatever you want to call it, methanol or whatever it's called, that's the size of your little bitty pinky, your fingernail, that if you was to inhale it, it'd basically kill you. We didn't have these problems back in the 80s and the 70s. Did we have problems in the 70s and 80s? Oh, you're darn right we did. We had the civil rights movement. We had other things that was going on. There was some more stuff that went on up towards New York that was profound. Whenever they had to basically bomb a community up there because of a bunch of rioting that was going on. Oh yeah, we had our problems. But it was nickel and dime problems in comparison to what we're having today. Because now what we're having today is generated on a global scale to where these problems isn't just in the United States people's laps. Now they're all over the world. Europe, France, Australia, all over the world, where they have had basic uprisings of some of the most craziest stuff that I've ever laid my eyes upon of events that's happening worldwide right now, which once more is the opposite of peace and utopia, the very things that I was started preaching about, my son and I, going back into 1989, going house to house, church to church, car to car, person to person. Went to all the congressmen up in the White House. White man speaketh with forked tongue. They talk about peace, but in reality, peace was not profitable. Well, how is our attorneys? How is our probation officers? Well, how is all our influential trials and judges and all this other stuff that goes along with the system? How are we going to make any money if there's peace? Well, you didn't want peace. That's the point that I continue to keep harping upon. You didn't want peace. Give the people what they want. They wanted corruption. They wanted all this hostility going on. They wanted all the drugs. They wanted all the guns. They wanted their prison cells to be full. You're getting what you wanted. This was a movement that began in the 80s with the Reagans. Nobody wanted to sit down and halfway listen to the things that I was teaching and preaching and telling them about pertaining to biblical Bible prophecy. So now it is led into the period and the point in time of where we are today, to where now we're actually questioning our own military decisions towards what we should have done and putting trust in people that we shouldn't have put trust in. Now it's beginning to fall full circle of the shame and the indignation, the embarrassing hypocrisy that has fallen upon to our ancestors' dreams and their desires that they intended whenever they first manufactured those two bombs and dropped them in Hiroshima in the 40s. I think it was 45, if I'm 44, 45, whenever it basically ended the war over there pertaining to Nazism. Those are the people that has been let down. Those are the people right now that's rolling around in their graves. Those are the people that's shaking their fist at us up in heaven. And you're wondering how come all these radical weather changes keep happening. Either towards it being drier than dry or wetter than wet. Those are the people that are telling their stories in the way that they're telling them towards watching all these radical events come down on us again and again and again. And once more, the people are not paying attention to the signs, and they're not listening to people such as myself. They're still excusing me off like, oh, he's a nut job. Oh, he's a radical this. He's a radical that. You know, everybody wants to compartmentalize everybody here in America. That way it justifies what compartment that they themselves are in. Well, they're over here. Well, she's a drunk. He's a drunk. She's a prostitute. He's a whoremonger. He's a dope addict. He's lazy. He won't work. He's a this. She's a that. You know, everybody wants to compartmentalize everybody. Everybody all of a sudden has become scientists and doctors here in America. And if the truth be known, they don't know their own asses from their hole in the ground. Whenever it comes to assessing not only other people's problems, but assessing their own. Going back to the Bible. What does the Bible say? It says, clean the mote out of your own eye before you worry or contend towards cleaning the beam out of your brother or sister's eye. You got to go back to self. And if you can't clean up self, the way self needs to be cleaned up, according to the Bible, according to the standards of the Bible, you don't have no right in trying to judge somebody else or bring some sort of a prognosis into other people's lives towards telling them what they either should or shouldn't do. This is sad. We're in a very, very sad moment in history, in American history, for the past 240 something years that we've been a nation. In addition to all the other stuff that we went through before we was a nation, in addition to the Revolutionary War, the Spanish War, and other types of things that's went on here in America, this is probably the top of the top. This is probably the saddest of the saddest. It's a shameful moment of time, moment of history, to where if we don't stop and analyze and question and debate one another in what has happened here, not just in the past 20 years, but let's go back a little further, in the past 30, I realize that this main event happened since we actually went to war towards trying to kill bin Laden. I'm not naive. I understand the time frame of all this. This was based upon 9/11 and the 20th year anniversary that just come about within the past few weeks. I'm not naive towards how that they're categorizing this in a time frame. The time frame that I'm talking about extends their time frame. You got to go a little broader, a little further. You got to look at the whole picture and not just part of the picture. That's what they're not doing. I don't know why they're not doing it, because it's all tied in with each other. Kind of like dominoes. One dominoes fell, another dominoes fell, it snowballed. That's exactly what happened. It snowballed that has put us where we are today, here in America, towards watching a country that is just as ludicrous, as barbaric, and heathenistic today as what it was before we ever walked off into it 20 plus years ago, by allowing the Taliban to take back over the same real estate, the same soil that our men and women was willing to suffer and pay the ultimate sacrifice for. So if the embarrassment or if the fault falls upon anybody, it falls upon the feet of those that had control of all these matters. It falls upon the feet of those that was making these type of decisions, that now ultimately we're all having to pay the consequences for, because the shame just doesn't fall upon them. It falls upon all of us. If you're an American citizen, you have to eat this too. It doesn't matter if you was political. Doesn't matter if you was a military personnel towards being one way or the other. It doesn't matter if you was a patriot for the war or against the war. It doesn't matter. This is something that we're going to have to wear the rest of our lives because of the bad decisions that's been made in the past.
Excuse me, General McKenzie.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify about recent events in Afghanistan. As the theater commander, I will confine my opening remarks to those matters that were under my direct operational control, specifically the withdrawal of U.S. forces and the subsequent non-combatant evacuation operation. These were two distinct combat missions, both conducted in contact with the enemy. We had a plan for each of them. We executed those plans. And thanks to the valor and dedication of thousands of men and women in harm's way, we completed both missions, fulfilling the President's order to withdraw all U.S. forces and evacuating over 124,000 non-combatants from Afghanistan. I last appeared before this body only days after President Biden announced his decision to withdraw all U.S. forces from that country, and my testimony regarding that decision is already a matter of public record. I'll only reiterate that I had an opportunity to offer my professional advice to the President through the Secretary, and I am confident that he weighed it carefully. That's all any commander can ask. Once the President made his decision, my headquarters and that of U.S. Forces Afghanistan under General Scott Miller made the withdrawal of our forces our top priority.
We did this in close coordination with our allies and partners. Every departure of every element was carefully synchronized across the coalition and with our Afghan partners. On no occasion were they caught unaware by our movements. Every base was handed off to Afghan forces according to a mutually understood plan. This is particularly true of Bagram Airfield. Many of you have visited Bagram at some point over the past 20 years and were probably struck by two of its defining features: its sprawling size and its isolation. Virtues for most of its lifespan, they rendered it untenable under the circumstances. The guidance I received in April was to conduct the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat forces and plan for a diplomatic security force of absolutely no more than 650 service members. It was not feasible to preserve the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, hold and defend Hamid Karzai International Airport, the embassy's key link to the outside world, and also defend Bagram Airfield with 650 soldiers and Marines. This is important. The Bagram option went away when we were ordered to reduce our presence to the 650 personnel in Kabul. I'd like to shift briefly to the NEO, which, as I have noted, was a completely different operation than the withdrawal. They were separate. The withdrawal began in April following the President's direction. The decision to conduct a NEO rested with the Department of State, and they made that decision on 14 August. In our NEO planning, Central Command assumed that we would have to bring out a very large number of people. We did not regard the size of a potential NEO as overwhelming or too much to accomplish. We did not regard a Taliban takeover as inevitable, but neither did we rule it out. And we identified critical indicators of an impending collapse of the Afghan National Defense Forces.
Now, isn't that some fancy talk? Neither nor did we rule it out. Talk about speaking out of both sides of your mouth towards not wanting to be accountable in the wrong, but now you're covering both ends of the perspective. How fancy a talk is that? I agree with this. I agree with all of them that the men and women that fought with honor. They fought tremendously in doing what they believed in doing, and the failure does not fall upon the feet of those that was actually boots on the ground. That is not where the fault falls. The fault falls upon those who are upper levels of authority: the brass, the top brass, the president, the Congress, all the other people that has been making these decisions for the little guys like us. That's where the fault falls. They're the ones that has brought this shame and this embarrassing moment in the history of the American people's lives, and they're the ones that basically our ancestors are shaking their fist at up in heaven towards causing these radical weather changes to occur every event from one right after another. Listen to some of the fancy talking. You'll understand what I'm saying whenever they're trying to cover their own rear ends towards what has occurred here.
We crafted branches to our base plan to account for a complete collapse of the Afghan security forces. The Secretary took action in May to make forces available to me for planning. On July the 9th, I requested that our base NEO force, the core package that would go in, be put on 96-hour prepare to deploy orders. By August 11th, it was evident to me that Kabul was at risk, and I requested the deployment of a brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division and other elements of our own alert pre-planned force package. And I requested that they be deployed into HKIA, Hamid Karzai International Airfield. These forces flowed swiftly into theater, even as the Afghan National Defense Forces disintegrated, allowing thousands of civilians access to the airfield. Working with Afghan partners composed of elite commando units who did not fall apart, and our arriving NEO forces, on August the 16th, we cleared the airfield and resumed flight operations in a matter of hours. With security reestablished by a force ultimately comprising 5,784 U.S. troops, 8 maneuver battalions, and hundreds of coalition forces, operations continued without interruption until our final flights. By that time, we evacuated over 124,000 people from Afghanistan. This was a difficult mission, made possible by the exceptional professionalism and valor of the joint force on the ground in Afghanistan and across the entire world. I would specifically like to use this opportunity to thank the C-17 crews of the Air Mobility Command for a feat rivaling and exceeding, in fact, the Berlin airlift. Moments after the last of the final 5 C-17s lifted off from HKIA, I held a briefing with the Pentagon Press Corps and expressed my gratitude and admiration for the forces who carried out this NEO. I also provided various figures that conveyed the magnitude of their accomplishment. I won't reiterate those figures here and now, but I will say that after the passage of nearly a month, my pride in their accomplishment remains undiminished. I don't need to tell this body that on 26 August, 11 Marines, 1 sailor, and 1 soldier made the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of their country. We will never forget them. This was a combat operation of the most difficult sort, a non-combatant evacuation carried out in contact with the enemy. The enemy in this case was ISIS Khorasan, a vile, tenacious foe that would undoubtedly have killed many, many more Americans and innocent Afghans at HKIA if it were not for the vigilance of our forces there. On 29 August, we undertook an MQ-9 strike against what we thought was an imminent threat to HKIA. That strike was a mistake, and I take full responsibility for that strike. I was under no pressure from any quarter to conduct the strike. It was based on our intelligence read of the situation on the ground. While in many cases we were right with our intelligence and forestalled ISIS-K attacks, in this case we were wrong, tragically wrong. I appreciate that there are many other topics of interest to this committee, and I look forward to answering your questions on all of them. I'll close here by reiterating my profound gratitude and appreciation for every soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, and guardian, as well as our intelligence and Department of Defense and Department of State comrades who contributed to each of these difficult missions. I remain humbled by their sense of duty and courage. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I want to drill down a little bit on keeping 2,500 troops there. And I'm struck as I listen to the comments that I think the real problem here is you have to make decisions in the real world. You don't get to imagine an outcome that would make it more palatable. And I think that's what really factored into the 2,500. And as we talk about the 13 service members who died and attacked the leadership here for not having prevented that, how you can do that and then advocate that we should have stayed in Afghanistan longer so that more service members, I guess the only way you can advocate that is to imagine a scenario whereby we could have stayed in a chaotic war zone, not had soldiers get killed, not have made any mistakes. You know, how you can not make mistakes in that chaotic environment, I don't know. And every member serving on this committee has been in those environments in one way or another. So you don't have the luxury of waving a magic wand and making all the problems go away and simply making a decision where nothing goes wrong. And it's really frustrating to hear people advocate that we should stay and still decry what happened. Do you think fighting in a war zone, there wouldn't be similar mistakes if we'd stayed there for another 5 or 10 years? More civilians killed accidentally, more U.S. service members dead in exactly the same way that we just saw? Sorry, that's very frustrating. But could you talk to us a little bit about the 2,500 service members who could have been left there, and then how you approach that decision, and what exactly, well, not what exactly your advice was to the president for what I said earlier, but how you approach that decision and how you attempt to deal with that while advising the president?
Well, first of all, Chairman, let me be clear that I support the president's decision to end the war in Afghanistan. I did not support staying in Afghanistan forever. And let me also say, we've talked about the process that we use to provide input to the president. I think that process was a very thorough and inclusive policy process, and the recommendations of the commanders were taken into consideration, discussed, and deliberated on throughout that process. As you indicated, I will always keep my recommendations to the president confidential, but I would say that in my view, there was no risk-free status quo option. I think that the Taliban had been clear that if we stayed there longer, they were going to recommence attacks on our forces. I think while it's conceivable that you could stay there, my view is that you would have had to deploy more forces in order to protect ourselves and accomplish any missions that we would have been assigned. It's also my view, Mr. Chairman, that the best way to end this war was through a negotiated settlement, and sadly, that did not happen.
Thank you. And let me just also say that I know there are members of this committee who think we should have stayed, who are honest about that application. I think of Congressman Waltz, who has been very honest about the fact, both under President Trump and under President Biden, that we should have stayed. He's very honest about the fact that there were costs and risks and lives would have been lost. That's the type of discussion that we need to have. But to jump down the president's throat because he actually had to make the decision in an impossible situation, I think does a grave disservice to this committee's ability to do effective and honest, nonpartisan oversight. Costs were going to be borne here. There was no easy option. And I do hope that people will remember that as we go through the questions and answers that will proceed. With that, I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, was the DOD in charge of making decisions about troop strength in this withdrawal, or were you in a support role?
Let me put it this way, you talking about the NEO or?
I'm talking about, well, let me just go back even further.
Okay.
In January of this year, were you of the opinion, in your professional military judgment, that we should have maintained 2,500 troops, U.S. troops, in support of coalition effort and contractors in Afghanistan?
Yeah, my assessment that I read in the opening statement remained consistent. Did
that professional military opinion change over the course of the next few months?
Not until presidential decision, and I rendered my opinions, and it was a fulsome debate on all of that. And once decisions are made, then I'm expected to execute lawful orders.
And you've made that very clear. So my question is, when the troop levels were ordered to be drawn down to 0 and first stopping at 650, as General McKenzie outlined, was that your decision or General McKenzie's decision to draw down to 650?
It was a task and then a troop-to-task analysis, with the task being to go to 0, but you also have to defend the embassy. So
I'm thinking about the chain of command. Mm-hmm. Somebody's making decisions about troop levels, and my understanding is it was not the DOD, it was the State Department or the White House. I want to know who said we're going to go from 2,500 to 650 and just protect Kabul and the State Department.
It was a military analysis that 600 to 700 could adequately defend the embassy until contractors come up, and that was then approved up through the chain and approved at the highest levels.
Who made the decision?
I would say that decision was made in a national security consultative process by the highest levels of our government.
General McKenzie, did you receive advice from General Miller in the end of 20 and early 21 related to troop levels in Afghanistan?
Ranking member, I did.
What was that advice?
The advice, his view and my view were essentially the same view. And my view was that we needed to maintain about 2,500 and that we also needed to work with our coalition partners. We had about 6,000 troops in there, NATO and other core countries that would remain there.
Did your professional military opinion change over the course of the spring?
It did not.
Did you communicate? Well, I know you communicated to the president. You said you did. Were you present in the room when General Miller's recommendations were relayed to the president?
Without going, General Miller was present in executive sessions that involved myself, the secretary here, the chairman, and the president.
And those recommendations of the parties, as Secretary Austin said, were debated fully in that meeting.
They were debated fully. I felt that my opinion was heard with great thoughtfulness by the president.
Well, you know, Secretary Austin just made the point that there was a fulsome debate of the pros and cons and the costs and risks. Yet, in August of this year, President Biden told George Stephanopoulos in an interview, no one said that to me, referring to keeping some 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. Was that an inaccurate statement by the president?
Sir, I am not going to comment on a statement by the president.
General McKenzie, in mid-June, your commanders on the ground were informing you that things were deteriorating. As you testified a little while ago, at that time, in your judgment, you should stop withdrawal and increase forces and or proceed with the retrograde. What did you decide at that time?
We decided to proceed with the retrograde.
Okay. Was were you ordered to do that by the president?
We followed our original we had original orders. We followed those orders through to completion.
Okay. Was it the president's orders?
My orders come from the Secretary of Defense through to the President, so it's a very short chain of command for me.
Okay. Secretary Austin, on the 23rd, you told this committee that you had developed a very detailed plan to conduct safe, orderly, and responsible withdrawal, and were executing that plan. On August 18th, the president said, quote, "The idea that somehow there was going to be a way that we could have gotten out with chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens," close quote. How do you reconcile those discrepancies between what you assured the Congress and what the president's telling us?
Thank you, sir. First of all, in terms of the withdrawal of our troops and the retrograde of equipment, that plan as developed by General Miller and General McKenzie was executed as planned, and all of our equipment was retrograded, and we drew down the force that we wanted to draw down to that very small force that you saw at the embassy at the very end there. The chaos that ensued followed the collapse of the military and the collapse of the government, and when those two things happened, then it was going to be a chaotic situation.
And the collapse of the government and the collapse of the military was solely the responsibility of this administration. I know y'all are trying to be careful politically, but it was the State Department and the White House that told you to make those drawdown of troops from 2,500 to 650 to 0. It was the speed with which they done it, that they carried out that order. That's what caused the chaos that we have. If they'd allowed the DOD to be in a command situation, we wouldn't have had this problem. General McKenzie's testified that the only reason he couldn't keep Bagram was because he had to draw down to 650 troops, and his primary orders were to keep Hamid Karzai and the State Department safe. We just have to admit this was the State Department and the White House that caused this catastrophe, not the Defense Department. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Now they're hitting the rubber where it meets the road. Now on accountability issues, they're hitting the rubber where it meets the road. But there still should have been a body from the Pentagon that are professional people that are trained to itemize, assess, look at all the different types of scenarios that may happen. And of course, in a scenario like that, you always hope for the best, but at the same time, you expect the worst. That way you won't be caught unaware. You won't be caught looking like an idiot. And that's exactly what did not happen, coming from the upper levels of government, that now, inevitably, consequently, we're all going to have to pay the embarrassing consequences for, because of these occurrences. Once more, what jinxed us? What got us on the wrong path in trying to reform a group of people over there that basically was unreformable, especially unreformable in the way that we was trying to reform them militarily? What got us on that wrong path? You got to go back to the core of origin. Where did this all first begin to start unraveling in a negative type way that has created all this anxiety, that has created all this anguish, that has created all this turmoil and all these lives being sacrificed and all this equipment? I mean, do you realize out of the $2 trillion that we have spent consequently in the past 20 years, if that same $2 trillion would have been applied towards our bridges and towards our road system here in America, do you realize how much further ahead that we would all be towards riding around on good, decent roads and not having to worry about our bridges falling in over the Mississippi River or some other major body of water? Do you realize how substantial that those decisions would have been if we would have taken that money, monetarily speaking, and applied it to our communities, to our ghettos, to our schools, to our advancement, medical knowledge? Do you realize how far that this has drug us down the road in the past 20 or 30 plus years that all this has been going on pertaining to terrorism? And to think that the people here in the United States not only didn't want to support the Windmill Ministries that has, once more, always supported peace and utopia through the teachings of Christ, but to think that they had the gall that now they was going to try to turn the tables on me towards me being the bad guy. I was the stalker. I was the terrorist. I was the bad guy. And to think that they thought that they was going to do this and get away with it just shows you the depth. It shows you the depth of how far a group of people is willing to go towards covering up their own faults and their own wrongs. And that all began right here in Northwest Tennessee in Weakley County. Not only did it occur in 2005 in my life of how that they was trying to brand me towards being a terrorist up in Martin, Tennessee, but then whenever I come back home in 2014, leading into the all the multiple occurrences that happened up until my brother died, and then forcing me to have to make a decision between freedom and admitting to guilt that I shouldn't have never had to admit to guilt to towards a stalking charge, that they was determined that they was going to take another charge and compile it with that charge just to be able to brand me even further. Once more, the character assassination that went on in my life goes beyond anything that I think that I've ever read about, heard about, or had a movie about here in the United States of a group of low-life, no good for nothing, worthless, sorry individuals that was willing to do this to their own people, to their own society, to their own flesh and blood, to their own American citizen. To think that they didn't appreciate me any more than that they was going beyond the boundaries of normal, cruel and insensitive, unhumane events of going on, that they was willing to do this to cover up their own wrongdoings. It speaks volumes. The proof is in the pudding. It speaks volumes about the type of people that I've been dealing with. And I've been dealing with a great deal of people. Not just here in Northwest Tennessee. Not just within the surrounding 7 or 8 or 10 counties here this side of the Mississippi River and this side of the Tennessee River. But I went beyond those factors. I went over to Middle Tennessee, East Tennessee. I went over into Kentucky. I was out in Ohio and Wheeling, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C., and New York, and went out west to places like Arkansas and places like Oklahoma and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Went down into places like Georgia, Florida. Lots of people have been exposed. And this was before the internet, or during the process of the internet. One day, whenever I get to heaven, and I'm fully convinced that I'm gonna make it into heaven. But there's a song that they sang here in the land. This is my story. This is my story. This is the things that I've went through. This is my story. This is my song. Singing all the day long. This is my story, this is my song. I'm going to have a testimony one day reaching into the pearly gates of heaven that's probably going to be on the same level of the same story that Jesus Christ had against his people over in the Middle East whenever they all turned against him over 2,000 years ago. My story will be similar to his. Now, I'm not going to say it's going to be as bad as his, but on the same ranking scale, the way that the people have contaminated themselves because of all this is going to be on that same level. And only God and the angels of God is going to be able to tell my story accurately again and again and again throughout eternity towards what has happened. Same way with Moses, same way with Aaron, same way with Jacob, same way with Noah. All these are testimonies, all these are stories of how that the people basically denied and rejected the will of God. The very will of God. These stories will be repeated again and again and again throughout eternity. The story of how that they crucified God's only begotten Son. The story of how that Noah preached to an audience for many, many years while building a boat. These stories will be told again and again and again of the accuracy of reality towards what has actually occurred. Going all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve, whenever they was deceived by the serpent, which was the devil coming in the influences of a serpent. It's so sad. As I've said before, this is a time and period in history, in American history, that our ancestors was praying and hoping would never occur. Now it has occurred. It has occurred. And we're paying the consequences on account of it dearly. Some a little more than others. Because if you had a child in school that recently was involved in a massive shooting, or if you had a loved one in Vegas whenever the individual kicked out the window and decided to kill, I think it was 60 or 70 people that day. If you had a loved one that was involved in the Oklahoma bombing that actually died during that event, if you actually had people that you know was set up or trapped by a drug-induced environment or whatever, they have went through the effects of all this directly and not indirectly. And now it's going full circle to the point that now it's coming back into all of them's laps, regardless whether it's a granddaughter or a daughter that wound up getting impregnated by a drug fiend, a low-life, no-good-for-nothing human being, and now she had to go out and get an abortion because of it, or your whole family structure is being rattled financially or some other ways. Yes, this has come full circle. This is probably one of the most saddest, I know it is, it's one of the most saddest moments in history that we've ever had to experience before in the history of America. That's saying something, buddy. That's pretty big.
The planning that led up to this. And I'll admit that I'm concerned that based on the conditions on the ground, General Milley and General McKenzie recommended against final withdrawal. I wish the administration had been more thoughtful and not had rushed this. I've yet to hear an answer to the question, though, of why did we not start withdrawing American citizens and SIVs sooner? We knew we were going to be withdrawing, whether we started doing that withdrawal of the Americans and SIVs in January or May or sooner than the actual execution of the order to withdraw. I'd like that question answered. Also, Secretary Austin, given the general's concerns, were the discussions about pushing the withdrawal back to spring of 2022 or conditioning it on the criteria in the Doha agreement to ensure that we did the handoff correctly. We already weren't going to fully withdraw by May 2021. And Secretary Austin, what was the military rationale of leaving by the end of August when the Taliban are at their strongest in the fighting season, as opposed to waiting in the winter months when there's more of a lull in the Taliban fighting season, where it's a relatively low of activity and they're at their weakest? To start with those questions.
And I'm sorry, before you get into I'm going to stick to the 5-minute rule. So when the clock hits 0, we're going to move on to other people. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. On the issue of why we didn't bring out civilians and SIVs sooner, again, the call on how to do that and when to do it is really a State Department call. We provided input, as I said in my opening statement, to the State Department. Their concerns, rightfully, were that, number one, they were being cautioned by the Ghani administration that if they withdrew American citizens and SIV applicants at a pace that was too fast, it would cause a collapse of the government that we were trying to prevent. And so I think that went into the calculus. And when you add into also into the calculus that the SIV process was at that point, very slow, deliberate, and not very responsive, with your help, we were able to curtail the time that it took to work through that process. But a number of things kind of came together to cause what happened to happen. But again, we provided our input, and we certainly would have liked to seen it go faster or sooner. But again, they had a number of things to think through as well. In terms of adjusting, or why the president chose to leave in the summer versus waiting until the next year, obviously a number of things went into his decision calculus. But as we came on board, the agreement that had been made was that we were going to depart by May 1. We were able to work to get more time to ensure that we could conduct a deliberate and safe and orderly retrograde. But again, the president made the decision that we would leave in the summer versus going into the next year. So, and I'll leave it at that, sir. Pending any more questions.
Secretary, I want to know how we now protect the country going forward. Former CIA Director and Secretary of Defense Panetta said that our national security is threatened by the Taliban takeover. One of our missions was to prevent a haven for terrorist groups, and I quote, "We have failed in that mission," end quote. Similarly, the director of the DIA has assessed that Al-Qaeda could threaten the homeland in 1 to 2 years. So I agree that over-the-horizon operations can be effective. However, I'm concerned that without complementary operations, they will be insufficient to keep us safe. Secretary Austin, are you confident that over-the-horizon capabilities on their own can mitigate the terrorist threat we face? Are you confident that we can prevent Afghanistan from becoming a haven? And how will you keep our country safe?
And I apologize, but the gentleman's time has expired, so that question will have to go unanswered.
I'd like that for the record.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In an interview on August 16th, President Biden promised to keep military troops in Afghanistan until every American citizen who wanted to leave was able to leave. This did not happen. Nor can we confirm the Blinken claim that he sent 19 separate messages to Americans telling them to leave the country since March of this year. Also unclear is the truth of the Biden claim that no military commander recommended leaving behind a residual force, even though all of you, starting courageously with General Scott Miller, have now made it clear that your professional military advice was to do so. On August 26, I formally requested all letters referenced that day by Biden from military commanders advising him on the Afghanistan withdrawal. To date, I haven't received a response. As a 31-year Army veteran myself, grateful to have 4 sons who have served in Iraq, Egypt, the southern border, and Afghanistan, I was immediately skeptical letters existed. President Biden left behind thousands of American citizens, green card holders, brave interpreters, and Afghan media reporters who worked with the United States. Biden was correct when he said the buck stops with him as the person responsible for Afghanistan, as well as for the terrorists that are now crossing the southern border to plan attacks on American neighborhoods. In addition to betraying the American citizens and the U.S. allies in Afghanistan, the Biden decision to have a premature withdrawal left the people of Afghanistan, who had 60,000 troops killed by the Taliban, under the complete control of the Taliban, a barbaric terrorist organization, as General Milley has confirmed, with Al-Qaeda. Again, Biden was correct. The buck stops with him. The war has moved from Afghanistan to American neighborhoods, equally endangering our allies of India and Israel. Mr. Secretary, even before the withdrawal, there were frustrating reports of Americans and green card holders being turned away at the gates of the airport or being instructed by the administration to stay away from the airport entirely. While other countries were sending their special forces into Kabul to retrieve their citizens and bring them to the airport, you repeatedly refused to do the same, even after promising at a Pentagon press conference on August 18 that, quote, we're going to get everyone we can possibly to evacuate, and I'll do that as long as we possibly can until the clock runs out, or if we run out of capability, end of quote. Mr. Secretary, the American public needs to know, did the clock run out, or did you run out of capability? Did you at any point ask President Biden for any more time or more support to enable your forces to stay and complete the full evacuations of American citizens, not leaving them behind, as promised? If so, what was the Biden response?
First of all, sir, thank you for your personal service in our military, and thanks for the service of your family members. We remain grateful. On the issue of evacuating American citizens and SIV holders or SIV applicants, this work continues on. We're not finished, and we'll make sure that we stay focused on this to get out every American citizen that wants to leave and has the right credentials to be able to leave. On the issue of the security at the airport, it was my assessment, and I remain convinced of this, that the risk to mission and risk to force was beyond significant. And had we stayed there much longer, we would have endured continued attacks by ISIS-K and potentially the Taliban. And as each day went forward, as that risk increased, we stood to have aircraft shot down. We stood to have people injured, additional people injured on the airfield. And so as we weighed those risks.
Mr. Secretary, I need to have this completed. And in fact, I'll be sending you questions for the record. And I really want to know how many Americans have been left behind. And so we'll get that. But I will be providing questions for the record, but I sadly believe that American families today are at a greater risk of murderous attacks at home than ever before. You talked about the attacks at the airport. No, they're coming here. And that is that in history, we are at greater risk. Suicide bombers can operate from the safe haven of Afghanistan, just as 9/11, and with the open southern borders. The example of May 8th, mass murder of over 80 girls in Kabul should have not been forgotten. The buck stops with 13 murdered Marines. Mr. Biden is disregarding the military advice, and I believe the president should resign.
I'm prepared to begin my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Heads up, I don't have a speech, so I'm launching into my questions right now, so get ready to answer them. With regards, General Milley, with regards to the November 11th unclassified signed order, whose signature was on that order?
Former President Trump.
Okay, and then 6 days later, that was rescinded after discussion. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what were the top three concerns with that particular order?
Well, the instruction had two lines. Line one was withdraw all force U.S. military forces from Somalia by 31 December. Second sentence was withdraw all U.S. military forces from Afghanistan by 15 January. So I went over and spoke to the White House and had some conversations with some folks, not the president.
Sure.
And we discussed the cost, risk, benefit, et cetera, and the feasibility, acceptability, and suitability of that order.
Okay. All right.
And it was subsequently rescinded.
Was that the first time? Well, I asked Secretary Austin in the last 20 years, given the history in Afghanistan, is that the first order at all that's come out asking for a withdrawal? Did we have withdrawal plans or withdrawal orders at all in the last 20 years from Afghanistan?
Absolutely. As you know, we increased our footprint in Afghanistan over time, and then we
and shrunk it, but not
a complete withdrawal.
Not complete withdrawal. That's different. I'm talking about zero.
Right.
Then
right.
zero. So, and was this would be the first time then? This November 11th order would have been the first ask for a withdrawal to zero.
That's
to
correct.
your knowledge.
To my knowledge. Sure.
Within the DOD, from president or anything. Got it. From any president, I should say. Thank you. Just trying to get timeline set. And this relates to General McKenzie. We talked about the 2,500. The recommendation, the discussion you had about 2,500 troops. Was that for a particular set of missions? And did those missions change? Therefore, that 2,500 became 650, became zero?
So when we looked at the 2,500 number, we were looking at a force that would have the ability to do very limited advise assist at a high level, assist in logistics management for the Afghans, but it would have been functioning at a very high level. So that was the force that we wanted to continue to keep on the ground. As we looked at going down to 650, you get a force that is almost exclusively built around the ability to defend the embassy and the airfield and provide entry-level logistics to the Afghans. By that, I mean a package comes into the airport, you give it over to the Afghans, they drive it away, and you have no way to track what happened.
Yeah.
We lost that capability.
Yeah, but based on the civilian leadership saying this is what the civilian leadership wants to do. Now you get to, and I know you're not arguing this point. You make the recommendations, giving your best advice, and then civilian leadership has the opportunity to say thank you, but here's what I would rather be doing.
That's absolutely correct.
So the mission changed.
The mission fundamentally changed when if going to zero means you're going to reduce all your capability to do any kind of real on-the-ground work, even at a truncated level with the Afghan forces. You're going to be talking at the ministerial level, at the very highest levels of government only, and you're not going to have any real visibility about what's going on the ground.
Yeah, General Milley, did you want to try to address that?
I did. I just wanted to clarify one thing. The 11 November order is actually not the first one. The first one's the Doha Agreement, which directs going to zero by 1 May. The 11 November order is an accelerated withdrawal to bring it to zero by 15 January. So two different.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll just, for the record, I'll ask this question because then this gets to kind of follow on to all of this. Is how do you define over the horizon capabilities, and like what are those specifically, and how do we execute those? And we're going to explore that a little bit more probably here today.
Sir, I'll be prepared.
We have 15 seconds.
I'll be prepared to talk a little bit about it today, but I think more importantly, I'll be prepared to come over at the direction of the Secretary and provide a classified briefing.
I think it'd be very helpful, and there may be an opportunity in the future to travel to the region and hear directly what it looks like on the ground.
With the chairman's permission, sir, I would offer that briefing by General McKenzie along with joint staff representation and my policy people.
We will definitely be following up on that. I mean, the issue of what we do going forward to deal with the counterterrorism threat out of South Asia is something this committee has already looked at and will continue to look at for a very long time. Mr. Turner is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I serve on both the House Armed Services Committee and Intelligence Committee. The Intelligence Committee has already been briefed from the intelligence community concerning their participation of the August 29th drone attack. General McKenzie, you've taken in front of us full responsibility for that. I have a series of information that I would like released to this committee so that we can adequately provide oversight to what occurred on August 29th. What we know from your prior statements is that you did not know who it was who was in the car, whose house it was, or who or how many people were in the house. This greatly concerns me as we look to the over-horizon claims that the administration has of its ability for counterterrorism. You did not, as your goal was stated, thwart or disrupt an imminent attack. You killed an innocent man, and yet an attack didn't happen. So there are serious questions concerning both the information that you had and the manner in which the execution occurred. So I would request that it be released to this committee and the Intelligence Committee, relevant video excerpts from the drones of August 29th, the protocols that were in place prior to this drone attack mission, the intelligence that an attack was imminent against our forces, and the approval of any of authorization to modify those protocols, including approvals for delegation of authority, including target engagement authority, who approved at the DoD and in the administration, and the data that the Secretary released to the IG. I just want to make it clear, Mr. Secretary, the fact that you have an IG investigation does not stop congressional oversight. I'll be sending you a list of all those. I'd like your consent that you're going to be providing those to us. They're certainly within the jurisdiction of our two committees.
I acknowledge, sir, and you are correct. There is a review going on of the strike.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Milley, with indignation in front of the House and the Senate, you have commented on the statements in the press concerning your phone conversation with your counterparts, General Lee, in China. Let's be clear, to give you some help with the indignation, those comments were in the press because that's where you put them. Now, you claim that you had information, and it's all over, that China was worried about an imminent attack. You did not tell the President, the Vice President, the White House Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Director of National Intelligence, either of the relevant committees in the House, including the Big Eight, which you know include Intel. You didn't tell the Intelligence Committee. You didn't tell the Armed Services Committee. You report that after you took upon yourself to have this phone conversation, that you told them of the conversation occurred. Not that China believed that we were going to imminently attack them, which, by the way, has never been true in my lifetime. And it may be true since they believed it. That's why they're digging ICBM holes faster than they can fill them with ICBMs. But you chose instead to handle it yourself with a phone call. So, General Milley, you offered all of the concerning intelligence, and I'm going to request that you provide it to us. I would like you to provide us the relevant intelligence information that you based your belief that China was going to believe that there was an imminent attack. I also want your request for declassification of the approval that you release that information that China believed so, including your request for declassification of your conversation that you had with General Lee and any approvals. I want a transcript of your call with General Lee, and I also want any readouts, memorandums, notice of calls, or outcomes. Now, you chose to talk to reporters instead of us, and that's great. That's of great concern. No one in Congress knew that one of two of the major nuclear powers thought that they were perhaps being threatened for attack. Now, Mr. Secretary, that turns my questions to you then. Mr. Secretary, if you learn that Russia or China believes that they may be subject to an attack by the United States, as a member of the President's cabinet, do you believe that information should be handled at the cabinet level and with the President, with the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense? Do you believe the chair and ranking member of Intel and the House Armed Services Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee need to know these? Or do you believe that a belief of the possibility of an attack by the United States against Russia and China is appropriately handled by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a phone call with his counterpart with one of those nations? Please tell me that you believe it elevates to the level that you would elevate that to the cabinet and to Congress, and not just have it be subsequently told to us all by newspaper articles in the Washington Post and the New York Times, as General Milley chose to do.
Thank you, sir. Obviously, we would want to follow standard protocol, and what you described is what I would, the type of actions that I would consider taking. But General Milley, as what I heard him say yesterday, and I think again today, is that his chain of command, the Secretary of Defense at the time, was aware of the actions, and so
After. What he said yesterday is after.
I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Chairman.
No, that's
Millie,
not correct. What I said yesterday, today,
If I could, hold on just a second, everybody. Time has expired. Mr. Turner is very clever. He made a very direct attack as his time was expiring. I'm going to violate the rules here a little bit and let Chairman Milley respond to that direct attack, hopefully briefly, and then we'll move on to the next witness.
with respect to the intelligence, I have it right here. I'll be happy to share it with you.
Great.
I guarantee that that intelligence was disseminated in the president's PDB, the vice president, the DNI, director of CIA, the Secretary of Defense, the assistant to the president for national security affairs, and others. That was significant, and there was a lot of it. It wasn't just a singular report. There was a lot. I'll be happy to share that with you and go over with you line by line. And it was significant, and it was concerning to the point where Secretary of Defense Esper, Admiral Davidson, and myself, along with others, had conversations about it. And I was directed by then Secretary of Defense Esper. First, he directed his Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia Pacific Affairs to make calls, and then me. Same thing. This is all done with oversight, and I tried to lay that out in the memoranda. I tried to lay it out in a timeline in an unclassified way that you can use it.
And we're gonna, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to leave it at that.
I'll be happy to take it up at a later date. Your convenience.
Mr. Courtney is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your service and testimony today. One comment, Mr. Chairman, before questions. Over the last month, including yesterday's Senate hearing, we heard a lot of, in my opinion, over-the-top claims that the U.S. had lost all credibility with its allies in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Last week, Mr. Chairman, we saw firsthand in Washington how mistaken that claim was. On Wednesday last week, I attended a ceremony over in the Senate where the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said that Australia was proud to go into Afghanistan together and leave together, degrading al-Qaeda and preventing a major terrorist attack, and in very heartfelt terms, thanked the United States, particularly the 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, and 1 soldier who perished while safely evacuating 4,100 Australians from Kabul. Boris Johnson, last week, who was also in town when asked about the U.S. standing post-withdrawal, said, "What I said to Joe Biden is how grateful I am for the amazing work of the U.S. military in helping us extricate in 2 weeks 15,000 British nationals from Kabul to whom we owe debts of honor and gratitude. The U.S. military were heroic." Of course, they were in town to enthusiastically endorse AUKUS, the new defense agreement in the Pacific, which, as Politico reported, despite all the hand-wringing over the last couple of weeks, was a powerful reminder that an American security guarantee with our allies still reigns supreme, and in the stroke of a pen has reaffirmed our engagement and collaboration with allies in a region that the National Defense Strategy has identified as our #1 priority. Secretary Austin, I just want to follow up on the August 29th drone strike, and General McKenzie on the 17th again gave a Central Command investigation report, which described it as a tragic mistake. You also that day announced that there was going to be a DOD follow-up investigation. Can you tell us what is the difference between what you described and what CENTCOM did, and when can we expect to see results from that, that investigation that you described?
Well, I directed a 3-star review of the incident, and certainly it'll take into account all of the things that General McKenzie and his team have done. But we'll look at the soup to nuts policy procedures, whether or not we followed our own practices, our outlined practices, and.
I'm going to end it right there towards going ahead and letting him talk, but hitting the mute button pertaining to all this, because to me, they're trying to cram entirely too much in a mixed bag, kind of like making a concoction. Let's say you're going to make a soup, and all of a sudden you want to throw everything in the world, including the kitchen sink, as the old saying goes, towards making this soup. Whenever you get to listening in-depthly to what they're talking about, it becomes almost confusing, because one minute they're talking about this subject, the next minute they're talking about this subject, the next minute they talk about another subject. In other words, they're constantly moving around. They're constantly going from the far right to the far left, pertaining to their conversations, pertaining to the subject matter at hand. And they've got several subject matters going on at the same time, which can be confusing to the average, everyday, normal person. I want to end by saying this pertaining to my countrymen. I love my country. I love it enough that I'm willing to sacrifice my very life for. I love my country that I've made great sacrifices in the past 30 plus years of how that I have been falsely accused and how that various individuals has tried to stain, corrupt, pertaining to my reputation as far as character assassination. In the exchange of the events that happened in 1991 in my particular life, which may not mean a hill of beans to nothing and nobody out there, but it obviously does to me. Whenever I was on my way to Washington, D.C., after recently being married on Highway 89, in front of Victory Baptist Church, in between Cydonia, Tennessee, and Sharon, Tennessee, I was on my way to Washington, D.C., to get with a group of people, preferably the media, in the exchange of telling my side of the story pertaining to the 9 tapes and pertaining to how that the United States government was going to war with the wrong people. With the wrong people. Keep in mind that Desert Storm and Desert Shield was right there together. But instead, they concocted a story in Wheeling, West Virginia pertaining to Homeland Security and charged me of possibly being an assassin to the President of the United States at that time, which was George Sr. Bush. And that's whenever it went from an indirect attack in Madison County in 1989 to now, 2 years later, to a direct attack that now we're sure enough going to stain this individual and we're going to assassinate his character by basically putting him on the same, compartmentalizing him by putting him on the same shelf as we do Bin Laden or we do any other known terrorist that has tried to bring harm and hurt to the American people. At that time, whenever they concocted a lie in Wheeling, West Virginia, in front of federal judges and federal DAs, and I had a federal representative representing me at the time, which was Jolene Nugent, that still is alive today in the Wheeling, West Virginia area, that still has a firm in her name if anybody is interested towards wanting to look her up and find out the paperwork in regards towards what happened, or you're more than welcome to come to me, because I promise you I've got all the paperwork towards what was said and what was done. But from that moment on, it was a not indirect attack, but a direct attack towards wanting to assassinate not just the character of the Windmill Ministries missions at that time, but to assassinate the individual that's sitting here talking to you right now. And I realize, coming from an American citizen, making such bold statements as that, most people in general probably are not going to believe, because by and large, people, up until the exchange of all this other stuff that's went on, by and large, people wanted to believe in their government. They wanted to believe that their government was not corrupt. They wanted to believe that the people that was associated with these types of decisions on upper levels of government would not go as far as trying to do something like this to one of their own American citizens. But I promise you, I've got authenticity on record of the very thing that I'm telling you about towards what that they was trying to pull over, not just against the founder of the Windmill Ministries, but what that they was trying to pull over against the Christian society, what that they was trying to pull over against God Almighty. These was deliberate attempts, because any time the president's life of any president gets noted towards being in exchange of some sort of harmful event, by law, they have to contact the president at the time whenever that event takes place. So I knew that the events that was happening in my life was definitely coming from upper levels. It wasn't just coming from Nashville Homeland Security. It wasn't just coming from Wheeling, West Virginia, or West Virginia Homeland Security. This was coming from the White House of various decisions that was being made after my son and I had went on a crusade with him, and then I went on 2 other crusades before 1991, publicly disclosing the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and going to all the congressmen and telling them that the first seal of the book of Revelations had been opened, trying to properly prepare them for the war of Armageddon. From that moment on, they had put me on a shelf, the same type of shelf as bin Laden or some other known evil entity that was trying to bring harm and hurt to the American people's lives. Now, I could have taken all of this and I could have rolled over and I could have said, well, who cares? I know it's a lie. I know it's going to be straightened out ultimately in the end, whenever we all stand in front of the great white throne judgment. Who cares what that they have done in my particular life? Because there's no doubt I was convinced thoroughly, not only then, but I am now, that this has probably went on in thousands of people's lives for whatever reason. I don't know if it was a spiritual reason or a political reason or a financial reason or whatever, but I'm sure that this has went on in America with thousands of people's lives. But because I know that it was a calling, a Heavenly Father calling that come from my Heavenly Father, pertaining to me standing up and being a part of this ministry, that's the reason why that I have pursued it as long and as strong as I have, to not only the general public, but especially to the church communities that let the ministry down to begin with. That's the reason why that I continue to preach and teach and tell people not only my story, but I tell them, as far as I am concerned, I was set up. I was used by the church communities going back into the late 80s, early 90s. I was used by them saying one thing out of one side of their mouths, but dialoguing something completely, totally different, leading into Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and ultimately the attack upon to the American people in 9/11 and all the other stuff that's happened in between. So I'm not doing this for the record. I'm not doing this for vindictive purposes. I'm not doing this to vindicate myself or liberate myself pertaining to me being so consistently with this story in what has occurred here, but I'm doing it primarily for the heavenly kingdom, God Almighty, and those 2 hands that miraculously come out of heaven, that I know without a shadow of a doubt spared my life in 1983, along with the operation towards me losing 9 units of blood, towards me basically removing a spleen. I'm doing it for my Lord and my Savior, God Almighty. Now, rather not the people that listen to this, those that choose to want to listen to my testimony, rather not they want to believe the testimony that I'm giving and why that I'm giving it, that will be up to them. Towards my true motive in behind why that I'm still living to this day, being able to stand in front of or talking behind a camera and announce to the world the grief and the suffering and the misery that the majority of us has had to have gone through was solely based around a certain group of people that thought that they was going to be able to get over on not only the true Christian society in not only America, but up onto this world, but they thought that they was going to be able to get over on the very kingdom of God that he rules to this day, with Christ being on the right-hand side of him, making intercession prayer for us, for if we sin, the very kingdom of God they was trying to manipulate. That's why I'm so consistent with my story, with my testimony. After going through one event, after another event, after another event, after another event in the past 30 some odd years, it's not to redeem myself. At my age, because of the condition that I'm in, because of me having type 2 diabetes, because of me being poisoned by the officials there in Kentucky, coming from land between the lakes, I could really care less at this point in time about liberating or redeeming myself. But because of the kingdom of God, I think that it's noted worthy towards me trying to redeem the true testimony pertaining to those two hands that miraculously come out of heaven that spared my life going back to 1983, in addition to all the other events that's happened in my life towards my Lord and my God sparing and saving my life of those events that happened either before 1983 or the events that happened after 1983. I'm doing this all in the honor and the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ and God Almighty, Yahweh and Yeshua. Thanks again for listening. Good luck to all of us as we have sat and listened to one hearing after another, those that remarkably have stayed with or wanted to follow my story in depthly, going all the way back to the hearings pertaining to the Donald Trump impeachment hearings, to now these type of hearings that's going on today. Thank you for being a part or allowing for me or us to be a part of your lives. Thank you for allowing for me to be able to speak on social network programs, to be able to put my story out there. And once more, I've got proof of everything that I've talked about, of one event right after another event right after another event. I've got boxes and boxes and boxes of material to back up everything what I'm talking about, including the 9 tapes that wound up going to the White House in 1988. I've got proof of these things. So I'm not just sitting here blowing smoke out of somebody's imagination or somebody trying to vindicate themselves because of the horror that has fallen up into their personal lives. I could care less at this point in time what has occurred in my personal life, because it's very obvious the people that I'm residing around could care less about the things that has occurred in my personal life. If they had cared about the things that had occurred in my life, and if they had any type of dignity about themselves towards wanting to work for the kingdom of God, I feel like that they themselves that want to put a platel on their coattail by telling everybody that they're a born-again Christian, I feel like that they would have automatically come forth towards trying to set the record straight. But maybe because of the shame, and maybe because of their guilt, maybe because they just don't want to come clean themselves, kind of like the government, they have chosen to be quiet or remain neutral. And if that be the case, that's fine. That's fine. but I know where I am with God. And I know that whenever I lay my head down every night, I lay it down in a sovereign, peaceful state, that if I do not wake up the following next morning, similar towards the way that my brother did at the age of 51, that I know that my soul, that God will keep it. And I know that I know where I stand with him. And to me, that's the most important part of my particular life, particular to the life of the ministry that obviously so many people wanted to be against in the beginning phases of, that I know where I stand with God Almighty. And to me, that's the most essential, that's the most critical, and the most important part of where I am today, because one day whenever I stand in front of God pertaining to accountability issues, and these others have to stand in front of God towards accountability issues, I know that I've been just as truthful and as honest with the people here up onto the planet as I possibly could have ever been. So there's really nothing that's motivating me towards me doing this pertaining to money, glory, fame, vengeance, trying to liberate myself, other than me standing up for the trueness of the kingdom of God and God Almighty through the Son Jesus Christ of Nazareth. I want to thank you. Good luck to all of us. As I'm ending, for time's sake, I've decided to cut this kind of short because they've basically just been repeating similar type questions or scenarios that they asked yesterday. This will be part 2 of Unequally Yoked that I labeled yesterday's testimony services over pertaining to the hearings. This will be part 2, a tail end of the very same thing. Good luck to all of us. God bless us. God bless those who are truly striving towards pleasing our Heavenly Father. God bless America. God bless our American troops. And as we end our program every time, good luck and shalom.